Thank you all for coming, and welcome to those people who are watching online, because there's quite a large audience watching online too. I thought I'd begin by saying something about how this talk came about. So you may be aware that a couple of years ago we carried out conservation work on this famous gesso panel by Margaret Macdonald, and we reframed it and we put it on display in the art gallery. And to mark that occasion, I wrote a blog post for the Hunterian. And, well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that it went viral, but that would be an exaggeration. But it was more popular than most of our blog posts, and that was nothing to do with my art historical insights or prose style. It was entirely, I think, to do with the level of interest, the widespread interest in Margaret Macdonald as an artist. And so colleagues suggested that I might do a talk about Margaret Macdonald, and this is the result. And I said that rather than do a general overview of Macdonald's artistic career, I'd rather look specifically at the sometimes vexed question of how her career was intertwined with that of her husband, Charles Rennie Mackintosh. When the critic Gleeson White wrote a series of articles about these adventurous Glasgow artists that were published in the Studio magazine in 1897, the founders of what we now think of as the Glasgow style, he said of Jessie Newberry, the wife of Fra Newberry, that, and this is a quotation, "In these days of Ibsen plays and married property acts, it was important to give individual recognition to both partners in an artistic marriage and not to subsume them into an undifferentiated couple." And it was 3 years after White made those remarks in relation to Jessie Newberry that Margaret Macdonald married Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And in influential articles published during her lifetime, her separate artistic identity was regularly asserted, even as her close collaboration with Mackintosh was also emphasised. This is the first page of an important article by the Mackintosh's friend Hermann Mutesius, which appeared in the German periodical Dekorative Kunst. And not only are husband and wife given equal billing in the title there, but their individual works are identified as such in the captions to the illustrations, as you can see here in this detail of the beaten metal panels on the front of the writing desk upstairs in the Mackintosh house. And here again, in an article in the Viennese periodical Ver Sacrum, Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Margaret Macdonald are distinguished from each other, and their works are individually attributed in the captions to the illustrations. So given the situation during their lifetimes, how have we arrived at this position a century later where Macdonald is regularly described in social media posts as unfairly neglected, overlooked, marginalised, almost the victim of a conspiracy to erase her memory in order to boost her husband's reputation? I should point out actually that the post on the left there says that the Macdonalds lived in Windsor Terrace. It wasn't actually this Windsor Terrace on Great Western Road, as the post suggests, but another Windsor Terrace off Mary Hill Road, and that suggests the sort of rather superficial level of research that goes into posts of this kind. It's a fact that in press coverage of the couple's work during their lifetimes, while Macdonald's work was discussed with respect and admiration, that Mackintosh was always recognised as the more significant of the two artists and was given greater prominence. And the perceived status of Macdonald and Mackintosh in relation to each other is made clear on the cover of the catalogue of the Memorial Exhibition of 1933, where Charles Rennie Mackintosh's name is in larger letters at the top and Margaret Macdonald's in slightly smaller letters below. And this wasn't just the perception of a male-dominated art world at that time. This exhibition, was organised by the very close, lifelong friend of Mackintosh and Macdonald, William Davidson. William Davidson, who'd commissioned the House Windy Hill from Mackintosh's first major domestic commission. Davidson was a lifelong admirer of both Macdonald and Mackintosh, and his aim in organising this exhibition was to honour the memory of both of them, and he went to extraordinary lengths to borrow representative works for display. The fact that the exhibition catalogue lists 167 works by Mackintosh and only 21 by Macdonald is simply a reflection of their relative productivity as artists. I think it's interesting that as well as organising the exhibition, Davidson also tried to find a publisher who would produce a book on Mackintosh, and he elicited the help of Jessie Newberry, who'd known Macdonald and Mackintosh since they were students, and got her to write to the art critic D.S. McCall in support of this publishing scheme. And Jessie Newberry, in writing to McCall, said that she wanted, quote, to fulfill after her death the years-long wish of our friend Mrs. Margaret Macdonald Mackintosh that her husband's work should be illustrated in a book which should hold an account of his career and work as a preface. And this seems to me quite strong evidence that Macdonald herself saw Mackintosh as the primary figure in their partnership and saw herself to some extent as the guardian of his reputation. Well, ironically, the memorial exhibition marked the beginning of the marginalisation of Macdonald and the belittling of her own reputation. And this was because of the intervention of the modernist architectural critic Philip Morton Shand. Shand was in the vanguard of support for European modernism in architecture, and he wanted to co-opt Mackintosh as a founder of the modern movement, and he tried to browbeat William Davidson into making the memorial exhibition serve this purpose. And all the decorative elements in Mackintosh's work that Shand disliked, he attributed to Macdonald, and he was incredibly scornful and dismissive in his judgment of her. And this is an extract from one of his very long and closely typed letters to William Davidson, in which he even ascribes Mackintosh's choice of artistic dress in this photograph on the right to the influence, the malign influence of Margaret Macdonald. No man, not even the vainest Frenchman, ever himself tied a tie like that. No great artist self-conscious. Surely Mackintosh had everything to be proud of, and that is why I refuse to believe he voluntarily got himself up as that parody of a great man. So he says that Margaret Macdonald dolled him up like that, is the expression he uses. Davidson, who I think of as a saintly figure, reading his correspondence, Davidson was amazingly patient and remarkably restrained in the way he responded to these tirades against Macdonald, who was, after all, a dear friend of his who'd only just died. I mean, it's extraordinary to think of the insensitivity of Morton Shand's letters. And in this letter, Davidson very gently urges the complementarity of Macdonald's and Mackintosh's work. And in a very humble way, he acknowledges that it's impossible to foresee how both artists' work will be judged in future. And he sees his own job as being simply to put their work before the public, for the public to judge. Well, in the end, Davidson successfully resisted Morton Shand's attempts to hijack the memorial exhibition for his own purposes. However, 2 years later, Shand published an article about Mackintosh in the Architectural Review as part of a series about the development of modern architecture, in which he wrote about Macdonald with undisguised contempt. And you know, the letters I've been quoting previously were private correspondence, but this was a published article, so it was in the public domain. And without any justification at all, he asserted that the decorative element in Mackintosh's interiors was wholly due to his wife, and made her the scapegoat for those aspects of Mackintosh's work that didn't fit his, Shand's, conception of Mackintosh as a pioneer modernist. I think it's difficult not to see this antagonism towards Macdonald as being in part motivated by straightforward misogyny on Shand's part. And when I read that remark in the bottom line about uxorious, ornamental vulgarity, I can't help thinking that it might be relevant that at the time of this correspondence with Davidson, the 47-year-old Shand had just been divorced for the third time. Shand sent a proof of his article to William Davidson shortly before publication, and Davidson pleaded with him, as you can see from this extract from one of his letters, pleaded with him to omit the scathing reference to Macdonald, but without success. And then 3 years later, Shand wrote the entry for Mackintosh in the fourth supplement to the Dictionary of National Biography. And it's about a page long. It makes no reference to Macdonald apart from two brief sentences in the final paragraph. And there, Shand describes her as being, quote, of decidedly inferior artistic calibre, although he concedes that she was Mackintosh's, quote, constant inspiration and his collaborator in all his decorative work. Well, I've dwelt at length on Shand's views, partly because they're so extraordinary and extreme, as to be almost entertaining, but also because they were extremely important and influential, because through these two publications, the Dictionary of National Biography and the earlier article in the Architectural Review, Shand shaped the opinions of Thomas Howarth, who published his seminal biography, Charles Rennie, Mackintosh and the Modern Movement, in 1952. As the title of Howarth's book makes clear, he shared Shand's view of Mackintosh as a pioneer modernist. And referencing Shand directly, he repeated Shand's view that Macdonald was an artist of limited talent and a wholly negative influence on her husband. And the status of Howarth's book as the authoritative account of Mackintosh's career shaped the way Macdonald was seen for a generation. Well, in Robert MacLeod, in his 1968 book on Mackintosh, was probably the first person openly to refute Morton Shand's and Howarth's view of Macdonald as a baneful influence on Mackintosh. But a revolution in the way Macdonald was perceived began in 1983, the 50th anniversary of her death. And it was in that year that Pamela Robertson, who is in the audience here tonight, organised a major monographic exhibition of Macdonald's work at the new Hunterian Art Gallery, which had opened just a couple of years previously. The display, recorded in these archival photographs on the right here, brought together the Hunterian's own holdings with loans from private and public collections. You can see one of the sconces from the V&A here, and the smoker's cabinet, and two bed hangings from the Hill House, both in the collection of the Glasgow School of Art here, as well as the Jesser panel that we saw earlier there. And importantly, the exhibition was accompanied by a catalogue containing a list of Macdonald's works, which is still the most comprehensive record of her artistic output. The catalogue also contained an essay which considered Macdonald's own artistic personality rather than seeing her only in relation to Mackintosh, and which gave, I think, a fair and balanced assessment of her achievement, resisting the temptation to overcompensate for the neglect that she'd suffered in the wake of Morton Shand's onslaught. And this exhibition and catalogue, I suppose, was the first volley in the battle to reassess the careers of Glasgow's neglected women artists 7 years before Jude Birkhouse's Glasgow Girls exhibition at Kelvin Grove. Well, now that Macdonald was rehabilitated as an artist in her own right, Timothy Neate was able to focus on her intimate life with Mackintosh in his 1994 book, Part Seen, Part Imagined, with its imaginative discussion of sexual symbolism in the work of both artists. And the following year, Alan Crawford's Thames and Hudson paperback, which I guess is still the most popular introduction to Mackintosh, appeared. And in a prominent foreword to that book, Crawford spoke of what he called the, quote, informal collaboration between Macdonald and Mackintosh. And choosing his words, I think, very carefully, Crawford wrote that, quote, the essence of their collaboration was not that he did some things and she did others, though sometimes this was the case, but that many interiors which are usually attributed to him seemed to be permeated with her influence. Now, I think this is quite a vague and fuzzy notion, and Crawford went on to acknowledge that he sometimes felt the, quote, clumsiness and inconsistency of attributing schemes jointly to both artists. But I think in that foreword and in his book, he had set a hare running, and now it seems to have become a widespread assumption that Macdonald and Mackintosh were jointly responsible for much of what was previously thought to be the work of Mackintosh alone. But this idea of informal collaboration wasn't simply invented by Crawford. We find it expressed by several contemporaries of the Mackintoshes who knew them well. So this is an extract from a letter written to William Davidson by Alice, the wife of Talwyn Morris, who had been an intimate friend of the couple for a long time. And she says, I can't read it actually at this angle. They worked and thought so much together that I've often thought I recognised in the work of either some impress of the spirit of the other. So there's this idea of an almost kind of mystical union and sharing of ideals that was expressed through their art, here stated by Mrs. Talwyn Morris. And this is just one example. So also in the correspondence around the time of the 1933 exhibition, another friend, Alan Mines, wrote, quote, when I speak of Mackintosh, I mean also his wife. They were one and are one. And Desmond Chapman Houston, a friend of theirs in London, said of the proposed memorial exhibition in 1933, I hope it may be a joint one, as to me their work is inseparable and complementary. So from now on, I want to look at how we're to understand this shared collaborative life of the two artists against the background of the historiography that I've just been through. A distinct aspect of the early work of the four, the Macdonald sisters, Herbert McNair and Charles Rennie Mackintosh, was their willingness to collaborate and their pleasure in collaborating. Margaret and Francis Macdonald began their careers after attending the Glasgow School of Art by sharing a studio and working collaboratively. And Gleeson White noted when he came to see them in Glasgow and wrote about them that they were happy for their joint works to be attributed to either one of them. One of their joint projects was an illuminated manuscript of the Christmas story. Some pages are signed by Margaret, some by Francis, but this one is signed and dated by both of them. The poster on the left was a joint production of Margaret and Francis Macdonald along with Herbert McNair, and it bears the names of all three. But a contemporary critic noted that it was so consistent in style that it would be impossible to separate out the contributions of any one of the three artists. Well, following her marriage in 1900, Macdonald came to share a studio with her husband rather than her sister. In 1899, Mackintosh had made two sets of drawings for an ideal artist's house, one in the town and this one in the top left corner, in the country. They were described in a contemporary publication as representing the home desired by the artist couple. This was on the eve of their marriage. And in both designs, as you can see here, the shared studio is dominant, occupying 4 times the area of each of the bedrooms. You might just be able to make it out in the little plan at the top there. when the couple moved into their actual married home at 120 Main Street, the shared studio was one of the interiors recorded by in Annan's well-known photographs of the flat, and here it is in the bottom left here. It looks absolutely pristine and quite unstudio-like in this photograph, but the image on the right suggests that it was indeed a place for making art. This is one of Macdonald's beaten metal panels for the Ingram Street tea rooms of Miss Cranston, and it's shown on an easel, and if you look closely at the background you can see that it's been photographed in the studio. You can see Mackintosh's distinctive candlesticks on either side of the fireplace and the bare timbers of the fireplace itself. So it was a workspace. I think we can imagine them working side by side in this space, and the furnishing and decoration of the famous interiors of the flat was credited in contemporary publications to both Macdonald and Mackintosh. And there's very strong contemporary evidence that they worked together on specific pieces for the flat, like the writing cabinet, which is now upstairs in the Mackintosh house. So here on the left is Mackintosh's design for that piece of furniture, with lots of annotations in his handwriting, and also indications of two alternative treatments of the metal key plates for the doors. And here on the right, differing in design from either of those alternatives, is the finished key plates designed by and made by Margaret Macdonald, as we know from this published illustration in Decorative Kunst. Because we know that they collaborated in this way in some well-documented cases, it's tempting to assume that they did so as a matter of course, but the picture's much more complicated than that. We know that Macdonald contributed embroidered bed hangings to the Hill House. We saw them in the exhibition earlier. And given her skill in embroidery, we might suppose that she was also responsible for executing the remarkable lampshade in the drawing room. It was designed by Mackintosh. His handwriting is all over this drawing. But in fact, the shade was made by someone else, by Miss Elvina Jane Gillies Campbell, a specialist lampshade maker who was paid £3.10 for her work, as recorded in the job book of Hunterian, Keppie and Mackintosh, of which there's an extract here at the bottom of the slide. So collaboration between Mackintosh and Macdonald, even in an area where Macdonald has specialist skill and experience, can't always be assumed. It's sometimes been claimed that the flower drawings, which bear the initials CRM and MMM, were joint productions. And in fact, William Davidson, who knew the couple so well, seems to have interpreted the inscriptions in this way. At the time of the memorial exhibition, when he'd gathered a lot of these flower drawings together, he wrote to a correspondent describing them, first of all, as drawings by Mackintosh, and then correcting himself and saying it would be more accurate to say they're by Mackintosh and Margaret Macdonald. And he obviously based that on his interpretation of these paired initials on the drawings. But there are other flower drawings with multiple initials, such as the one on the right here, where the initials stand for Margaret, Toshi, Francis, Bertie and Charles, Margaret's brother. And with the best will in the world, you can't imagine that a small drawing like this, absolutely consistent in character, is the work of 5 different hands. A much more likely explanation is that in adding these initials to the drawings, Mackintosh, who was responsible for the drawings, was somehow commemorating, recording the presence or the significance of other people who were there at the time that he was making the drawing, that they were part of the occasion in the same way that the flower itself was part of the occasion. And at the same time, the drawings themselves are absolutely consistent with flower drawings that Mackintosh produced much earlier in his career, before his marriage. There's a definite line of descent from those earlier drawings. Famously, the couple's work was presented together by invitation at the 8th exhibition of the Vienna Secession in 1900. And the display included collaborative works such as the Smoker's Cabinet, which had beaten metal panels by Macdonald. But the space was dominated by these two panels intended for Miss Cranston's Ingram Street tea rooms, the Wassail and the May Queen. And here for once we have a brief description in Mackintosh's own words of the pair working together. I think I've actually got a reproduction of the letter itself here. So Mackintosh is writing here to Hermann Mutesius, this German art critic and friend and supporter of the couple, and he's describing the work that's going on the Ingram Street tea rooms. And he says, just now we are working on two large panels for the frieze, 15 feet long and 5 foot 3 inches high. Miss Margaret Macdonald is doing one and I am doing the other. We are working them together and that makes the work very pleasant. We have set ourselves a very large task as we are slightly modelling and then colouring and setting the jewels of different colours. But this description by Mackintosh is slightly ambiguous. By working them together, does he mean that he and Macdonald are working side by side but each on his or her own panel? Or does he mean that they're working on the same panel at the same time, like the Macdonald sisters and McNair on the poster that we saw earlier, or the illuminated manuscript that I showed? It's not clear from the description. We have in the Hunterian 2 photographs of these panels, and they're annotated on the back, again in Mackintosh's own handwriting. And as you can see, he says of the May Queen, designed and executed by Margaret Macdonald Mackintosh, and then on the back of the Wassail, designed and executed by Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And this seems like fairly incontrovertible evidence that they took creative responsibility for the two different panels, but it doesn't quite make sense. It's impossible to believe that two such similar compositions were arrived at independently by two artists working completely separately. And it seems perhaps more likely, although it's open to question, that Mackintosh, as the architect and designer in overall charge of the Ingram Street project, was responsible for the general form of the two panels, but the detailed working out of the May Queen composition and its execution were due to Macdonald. The Vienna exhibition was followed 2 years later by the room setting known as the Rose Boudoir, which the couple exhibited at the International Exhibition of Modern Decorative Art in Turin in 1902. And here again, press coverage presented the room as a collaboration between both artists, while individual items, notably the two gesso panels that provided focal points at either end, were identified as Macdonald's work. But the architectural treatment of the space was recognised as Mackintosh's. Also included in the Turin exhibition was the portfolio of designs prepared in 1901 for an international competition to design a house for an art lover. Macdonald and Mackintosh had submitted a joint entry in the competition, but this was because the rules for submissions were that submissions must be collaborations between architects and decorative artists. And when their designs were published in 1902 in the form of a portfolio, it was under the name of the architect Mackintosh, and Macdonald was identified only as having contributed the decorative panels in the music room, as you can see in the captions to this print. There's a frequently quoted sentence in one of the letters that Mackintosh wrote to Macdonald from France in 1927, in which he says that she has been, quote, half, if not 3/4 of everything I have done in architecture. You can just make it out here. And this has sometimes been taken literally as conclusive proof that Macdonald was Mackintosh's equal but hidden partner in his architectural career. However, Pamela Robertson has pointed out the significance of the context in which Mackintosh made this remark. He'd been approached by a London-based journalist, Christian Barman, who was seeking his views on contemporary architecture, but Mackintosh, was intently focused on his new career as a painter in France and was reluctant to become involved again in debates about architecture, which for him lay firmly in the past. Nevertheless, he suggested to Macdonald, who was then on a visit to London, that she might speak to Barman on his behalf. By saying that she'd been half, if not three-quarters, of everything he had done in architecture, he was perhaps reassuring her that she could speak of his work with sympathetic understanding. Architecture is almost always a collaborative art, and to see a building as the work of a single architect working in isolation is usually misleading. But whatever Mackintosh may have meant by his half to three-quarters remark, I don't think he can have meant that he and Macdonald shared responsibility between them as equal partners in designing complex architectural projects such as the Willow Tea Rooms and the Hill House. Architecture was the highly technical profession for which Mackintosh had prepared from the age of 16 by undertaking a 5-year apprenticeship supplemented by intensive, he supplemented this intensive on-the-job training by attending evening classes at the Glasgow School of Art, where he entered national competitions and won prestigious prizes, and he undertook sketching tours in Scotland, England and Italy, making innumerable drawings of historic buildings, which can be shown to have fed directly into his own architectural designs. As a woman of her time, Macdonald would not have had access to these opportunities. And of course, that doesn't mean that she couldn't have had innate architectural talents, which she developed through natural ability without training. But it's difficult to see any evidence of this in her authentic works. Architecture is above all a three-dimensional art, which requires the architect to be able to think in terms of space and volume. As you can see in Mackintosh's interiors at the Willow Tea Rooms here. Nothing in Macdonald's art, gesso panels, watercolours, reliefs of beaten metal, suggests that she had this ability. On the contrary, hers is emphatically a two-dimensional art of linear surface pattern. There's nothing in her work that compares with Mackintosh's analytical approach to natural and man-made forms. Nothing, in other words, that looks like the work of an architect. There are contemporary published accounts of the Hill House and the Willow Tea Rooms written by the couple's friend Fernando Agnoletti, which contain no hint of that Macdonald contributed to the architectural design of either building, and yet these accounts won her warm approval, and she wrote approvingly of them to Herman Mutesius. It's clear that Macdonald was intimately involved in Mackintosh's creative life, and no doubt he benefited greatly from her advice and her opinions and learned from her observations on his work. But the details of this kind of creative exchange are undocumented and indeed unknowable. Now, as I said previously, there's no evidence at all for the view put forward by Morton Shand that Mackintosh's use of sinuous decoration derived from plant forms was due to his being led astray by the corrupting influence of Macdonald. His drawings for furniture and interiors are full of this kind of decoration, which is integral to his overall approach to design and which he developed from his lifelong fascination with plants and flowers. But I think there may yet be discoveries to make about Macdonald's contribution to the decorative aspect of some of his interior schemes. The stenciled linen panel on the left here is in the Hunterian collection. It's one of several in the collection. And it's traditionally been attributed to Mackintosh and said to have come from the rear ground floor area of the Willow Tea Rooms. And you can see by comparing the panel with this photograph that the pattern is exactly the same pattern as appeared in the Willow Tea Rooms as shown in this archival photograph. However, I think it's more likely that the panels actually come from the room setting that the Mackintoshes exhibited in Moscow in 1902. This is another of the panels in the Hunterian collection, not yet mounted or conserved. It corresponds exactly with the panels in the Moscow exhibition, and it doesn't have the additional blank section at the bottom, which you can see in the Willow Tea Rooms panel. So I think it's much more likely that these panels were used in Moscow and then returned to Scotland and just put into storage. In a review of the Moscow exhibition, the Russian critic Mikhailov referred to certain, quote, drawn panels by Macdonald, which he described as languorous, with a refined sensuality, a subtle sense of voluptuousness, not a heavy one, but one that induces hysterics and stupor. Her figures, with eyes wearied from sweet bliss, are so positioned that the viewer clearly feels a masked carnal act of madness being assimilated by, sounds a bit like Timothy Neat, assimilated by the imagination. Mrs. Mackintosh's drawings are a page from a sexual psychopathology narrated in the language of wood, metal, colours and line. I mean, the reference to metal makes me think of the aluminium leaf that's applied to these panels. And I think it's difficult to see what Mikhailov could have been describing in the Moscow exhibition other than these stenciled panels. And if he was correct in ascribing them to Macdonald, that must alter our view not just of the Moscow exhibition, but also of the Willow, where the panels must also be by Macdonald. Certainly the motif of the full frontal female face half hidden by roses is one that occurs again and again in Macdonald's art. Here it is on the left in a drawing which is currently on display upstairs in the gallery, and in the beaten lead relief in the middle, which seems to be based on the drawing on the left there, both of the mid-1890s. And here it is again in a design published in Versacrum in 1901, the female face partly hidden by roses and hair and partly veiled. And here it is again in two of Macdonald's gesso panels. And it's a very short step from the face in the white rose and the red rose to the face in the stenciled linen panel from Moscow, but also the same design appeared in the Willow as well. Even down to the sort of lobed ornament on the forehead there in two sections. And certain differences in handling might be accounted for by the fact that this is a stencil, which involved cutting a resistant material with a blade rather than drawing, as in the panel on the left. I think Alan Crawford may well be right when he says that Mackintosh's interiors are permeated with Macdonald's influence, but unfortunately, lack of documentation means there's no easy way of testing this theory. Piecing together small scraps of evidence, as I've just tried to do with these stencil panels from Moscow, may, in time, yield more evidence of her involvement. Mackintosh and Macdonald's friend William Davidson, in one of his patient letters to Morton Shand, acknowledged the possibility that they influenced each other, but he didn't think it was a particularly important point. Amusingly, he said, it was, quote, very interesting from an academic point of view. And the fact that I'm talking about exactly this question in the Hunterian Art Gallery 92 years later seems to prove his point. None of this, however, should distract us from admiring the qualities of Macdonald's own independent work, which made a highly distinctive and original contribution to painting and design in the late 19th and early 20th century, in paintings like L'amour parfumé, which is also on display temporarily upstairs this evening, and in the strange and hauntingly sad legend of the Blackthorns. The art market certainly seems to have decided that Macdonald is an artist of the first rank. The day and night panels from the original Smoker's Cabinet sold for €94,000 in Vienna 6 years ago. And last year, Macdonald's beautiful Annunciation panel, long thought lost, resurfaced and sold in Milan for €140,000. But I'll finish with a familiar photograph of Mackintosh's bedroom in Regent Park Square. Familiar because it's published in Thomas Howarth's book, Charles Rennie Mackintosh and the Modern Movement. But it's published there on a very small scale and a rather poor quality reproduction, and this digital file allows us to see it more clearly and to recognise among the pictures displayed above the fireplace on the left 2 of those well-known photographs of the immortals having fun in Ayrshire. I've reproduced the actual photographs on the left there, and you can perhaps see that the 2 outer photographs in the lower tier above the fireplace there. And of course the photographs feature, among others, Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Margaret Macdonald. And the room contains examples of Mackintosh's furniture, that most notably the sideboard cabinet in the centre there, but also the candle holders to either side of the fireplace and the strange stencilled frieze. But I think it has a rather makeshift, improvised, uncoordinated look, and it's a very far cry from the exquisitely refined rooms at 120 Main Street, created just a few years later. And in the interim, of course, Mackintosh had courted and married Macdonald, and the change between Regent Park Square and Main Street just might be evidence of her role both as a catalyst and a creative partner. Thank you very much.